classified along racial lines. So before slavery in America, or before slavery was, was the institution that it eventually became, the colonial population consisted largely of a great mass of white and black bondsmen who occupied the same economic category. So they were indentured servants, and the black people who were initially brought into this country were mostly indentured servants, and they worked alongside white Europeans, poor white Europeans who struggled to survive against a common enemy, which was the big landowner, planter. And so then there was an increase in the demand for land, and they continued to invade larger territories, and the Native Americans were growing to be an impediment to white European progress. So they needed more labor, and the demand on the plantations grew, and the demands were met through slavery. The Native Americans were unsuitable for slavery because of the positions of the tribes to fight back. Europeans were considered poor choices for slavery because of the short supply, and this would also interfere with their voluntary immigration. So what can be somewhat surprising is that there wasn't this idea that black people were inferior and therefore more suitable for a role like slavery. It was purely economic. Nathaniel Bacon was a white property owner in Jamestown in 1675, and he decided to unite slaves and indentured servants to riot against landowners and the planter elite. And this really had more to do with an issue that he had with the landowners. He wasn't a revolutionary or an activist or anything like that. But he basically developed plans to seize Native American lands from landowners in order to acquire more property for himself. He openly condemned the rich for their oppression of the poor and inspired an alliance of white and black bond laborers. He failed. He was defeated, but this caused a great deal of panic and fear among the landowners. And so they decided that they needed a different strategy. And so they abandoned their heavy reliance on white indentured servants in favor of importation of more slaves. And this led to the racial bribe, which is deliberate strategic privileges extended to the white indentured servants. So it put them in a different position now and gave them privilege, and it drove a wedge between the white indentured servants and the black indentured servants, or the slaves. So by 1770, the system of bond labor had been formed into a racial caste system. So even if you were occupied the same economic space, the white indentured servants were superior, you could say. So the degraded status of the Africans was justified on the grounds that the blacks, like the Native Americans, were an uncivilized lesser race. So this idea started really to take hold. And the notion of white supremacy rationalized the enslavements of Africans. So people were really starting to accept this idea. And the southern slaveholding colonies agreed to form a union only on condition that the federal government would not interfere with the right to own slaves. So now this was starting to affect government and how it was structured. So once the language of the Constitution, you could even see that is designed so that the federal government would be weak, and the language was actually colorblind. There's no mention of the word slave or Negro. And the document was really a compromise, built upon a compromise regarding the prevailing caste system. And so if we go to the death of slavery.
Back or forward?
Forward, yeah. Yes. So, so white supremacy became a religion, basically. The faith and idea that blacks were bestial, that whites were inherently superior, and that slavery was for black people's own good, was a dominant idea. So even after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, the idea of race continued to live on. So following the Civil War, the economic and political infrastructure of the South was in shambles. The plantation owners were suddenly destitute. There was a large amount of real estate and property that was destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of men had been killed, and there was, of course, the challenge of reconstruction, of rebuilding. And there was also the demoralizing effect of losing the war. And on top of that, there were hundreds of thousands of, freed slaves, suddenly, that were around. So the Southern whites believed that a new system of racial control was required, and they didn't know what to do. So rumors of insurrection terrified whites, and blacks increasingly came to be viewed as menacing and dangerous. This also led to the, stereotypes that still exist even today of black men as aggressive and dangerous. And so you have the situation now where there's a large number of former slaves, and most whites believed that they lacked proper motivation to work, that they were lazy, and this prompted the Southern legislators to adopt the Black Codes. So the Black Codes were a set of laws that were intended to establish systems of resembling slavery, basically, and foreshadowed Jim Crow. So Jim Crow was more about segregation, and the Black Codes just controlled the freedmen, the freedom of the freed men. And so an example is that the Vagrancy and the Convict laws. So there were 9 Southern states that adopted this law, the Vagrancy law, which made it a criminal offense to be unemployed. And this was applied selectively to blacks. So if you were found jobless, you would be arrested. And 8 of those 9 states enacted the convict laws, which allowed for hiring out of county prisoners to work in plantations. So it was slavery all over again. So this continued for years, and then Reconstruction happened, and this was a period of black advancement. There were a great deal of laws that supported freed men. There was the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery officially. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which bestowed full citizenship upon black people. And the 14th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying citizens due process and equal protection laws. So there were all these extremely progressive things happening at that time. The 15th Amendment also, the right to vote couldn't be denied on account of race, so things were looking positive. And then there was the Freedmen's Bureau also, which was an agency that provided food, clothing, support, education. And so it appeared that the racial caste system in the South was being undermined, and things were changing. There was protection of black people with the use of federal troops. Blacks began to vote in large number. Literacy rates climbed. In 1870, at least 15% of all Southern elected officials were black, and we mentioned earlier that this was significantly higher than the rate 100 years later. So this gives you a little sneak peek as to what happened after, it's actually really fascinating. So the new civil rights laws were really symbolic in nature. And also there was no language that prohibited the states from imposing educational or residential conditions on voting, like poll taxes, literary taxes. So people were being denied their rights, but in a different way, and it was done completely legally. And most blacks were too poor to sue to enforce their civil rights. Also, there was the threat of violence that loomed over them. And then at this time, the separation of races had really begun to emerge as a pattern through the South. Racial segregation had actually been taking place in the North before this, because it was an effort to prevent race mixing when, at a time where slavery didn't exist there. So they had started the segregation in the North while slavery was taking place in the South. So anyway, this evolved into a stunningly comprehensive new caste system. So then we have now the birth of mass incarceration. Oh, sorry. Skipped your whole era.